we couldn't think of anybody better to introduce the role of company secretary and introduce the topic than Peter Swabig from the Charter Governance Institute. Peter knows all about the different complex legal and regulatory environments in which the company secretary operates. And knowing Peter, as we've got to know him a little bit, he will also have in his store cupboard a few humorous anecdotes and stories about what he's seen on the ground and how the role operates well. So we thought no better person to introduce and burst some of the myths around the role, or talk about some of the realities of being a company secretary than Peter. So I've given you the big build up there, Peter. I'm going to invite you to talk for a few minutes, and then we'll have a good conversation with governance professionals about their experiences. So great to see you as always.
Okay, that's fine, Steve. How long do you want me to talk for? I'll just ramble.
Just ramble, and I'll give you the sign.
All right. Okay, fine. It's what is it? You get that shepherd's crook thing, and yeah, you'll see that fly in. Okay, so the role of the company secretary or governance professional, and for me, a little bit of a spoiler alert, or it may not be a spoiler, I don't know, but I see the roles fundamentally as being broadly similar. I think in some organizations you'll be the governance professional. I think in some organizations you'll be the company secretary. In some organizations, those two roles would be completely the same. In other organizations, the company secretary has a very defined role is in terms of compliance. And, you know, in other organizations, the company secretary is, you know, literally a jack of all trades doing all kinds of things. One of my favorite stories when I was out on the road as a young registrar going out to sell services to companies was driving into the car park and seeing the company secretary on her hands and knees in the car park. And I thought, well, this is an appropriate way to greet your registrar when they arrive. And the first word she said to me was, "Oh, good, you've arrived, you can help." That worried me slightly. And she was measuring the car park spaces because as company secretary, she was also responsible for premises. And the issue was that the chief executive had driven into the car park that morning and pranged his car. And the reason for this obviously wasn't that he was rubbish at reverse parking, because he's a chief executive and they can't possibly be rubbish at reverse. Are there any chief executives on the call, Steve? I'm sorry if I'm being rude to somebody here. But obviously the reason wasn't that he was rubbish at reverse parking. The reason was because his car parking space was clearly too narrow. And she was tasked with measuring the car parking spaces. And the funny thing was that his car parking space actually was 3 inches narrower than all the other car parking spaces. But that was because he'd insisted on being the one nearest the door. And they'd started measuring them out from the edge. And when they got in, there was 3 inches too little. So they just, oh, well, that will do. So yeah, he was absolutely right. But yeah, nobody told him. We didn't tell him anyway. So the role of the company secretary can take on a variety of things. But I wanted to start off this morning just talking a little bit about governance and what is governance. Because I think that's an important piece of background for us all to understand when we're looking at this. And I'm an old corporate man, so I go back to the first principle of the original UK Corporate Governance Code, the Cabinet Committee Code from 1992, which says corporate governance is the system by which companies are directed and controlled. Now, as time has gone on, we've looked at that and we've developed that a little bit, because more and more sectors are being involved in governance. And I mean, I suppose one thing I should throw out here is that at the Institute, we're the professional and qualifying body for company secretaries and governance professionals across all sectors. So we look after the corporate sector. We also look after the education sector. We also look after the sports sector. And my Lord, they've got some problems at the moment. We also look after charities and so on and so on. So it's quite pansectoral what we're looking at, rather than the specific approach that I think some of you are used to here. So what we've rationalized this definition down to is that governance is the system by which organizations are directed and controlled. And it doesn't matter whether you talk about your ultimate governing authority and call them the board, or whether you call them our governing body or the trustees. It doesn't matter what you call them, and it doesn't matter what you call the individuals who sit on that group. Fundamentally, it's all the same in my view. But that leads us on then to questions about what is good governance and what is bad governance. And I suppose, in a sense, you can talk about governance as stopping organisations going off the rails. Governance is giving organisations a license to operate in society. But one of the challenges for us all, I think, is that the term governance, and therefore by definition governance professional, become a sort of catchy shorthand way to describe a variety of political and economic institutions and outcomes. And as such, I don't think it's necessarily a particularly useful concept when we're talking about some of these things. I often get really wound up when I see something in the newspapers about bad governance or governance failure, when actually it's not always that. There's a popular view that good governance will prevent organisations failing. Now, I don't think it will. I think it'll make it less likely. But for me, the failure of organisations, particularly companies, is a normal part of business and can happen to the best governed organisations. And it can be the result of a poor decision made by the board. They've had perfectly well prepared information. They've just made a poor judgment. Or it can be the fact that an individual has either maliciously or mistakenly driven the coach and four through the governance practices of the organisation and has therefore caused a failure. And you might think back to those of you who are old like me can remember Barings and Nick Leeson, who went drastically over the amount he was allowed to invest. And yeah, nobody did anything about that in time. That was an individual creating a problem. And I think it's really important to emphasize the difference between governance and management. So the fact that management is doing, governance is oversight. And I think a really important part of the company secretary or governance professional's role is sort of acting as a bridge between the management and the oversight of an organization. It's looking at the issues that create dysfunction between those two groups. To a degree, it's sort of like acting as the referee. And I'll come back to the idea of the governance professional as referee a bit later. But it's also about things like ensuring that the board does the things that the board needs to do, and working very closely with the chair to ensure that that happens. Because if a board gets too operational, what you see is demotivation. You see tensions between the board and the senior management team. You see duplication of effort. You see people wasting time, and it can be incredibly demotivating for all concerned. So, in a nutshell, that's where I think the governance professional comes in. Now, if we go back in time, go back in history to the sort of time that only Steve and I can remember on this call, 1887, Lord Esher, who was the Master of the Rolls, and then that's not something to do with bread. That's some sort of legal job. I don't know. But anyway, he said, as secretary and a mere servant, his position is he's to do what he's told, and no person can assume that he has any authority to represent anything at all. That was 1887. And the point I'd make there is that things have moved on an awful lot since 1887. 1971, Lord Denning talked about company secretary being the chief administrative officer of the company with extensive duties and responsibilities. By the time we get to Cadbury in 1992, we're talking about the role of the company secretary in terms of facilitating the information that the board needs in order to function effectively. And for me, I think fundamentally that's what a lot of it is about. So if we move on beyond Cadbury, what we then find is looking at the role that the company secretary or governance professional has in good governance. So it's adding value, it's helping the chair run an effective board. It's acting as a wise friend and counsellor to the various directors, governors, trustees, whatever they might be. It's developing relations with those people so that you can effectively be a first point of call for them. But it's not necessarily acting as some sort of captain compliance. It's not acting as a corporate policeman. It's more about that seeing both sides of the argument, supporting the board. And that can sometimes involve issues of conflict. And we heard on the session earlier about complaints and the way in which complaints are becoming more prevalent. You're seeing that across the board. You're seeing that in a variety of sectors. You're also seeing an increase in the level of interest being shown by some of the directors. Certainly, when I first took over a company secretarial role, there was a certain amount of when it got to the situation where you needed a new director, the chair would look around the board and say, "Now, does anybody know anyone?" Now, that's not what happens these days. It's usually a much more focused process, looking at the skills and competencies that are needed on the board. So for the role of the company secretary, you're looking at balancing the interests of different groups on the board, looking at the various agendas, because I know, and you as governance professionals know, that although in an ideal world, the only agenda in the boardroom is the one that you agreed with the chair, actually, in most boardrooms, there are a whole heap of agendas, because everybody around that table has bought their own wish list to the meeting, and I'm probably as guilty as anybody else of doing that. So it's keeping to your agenda. It's driving that through with the chair. It's balancing the interests of the different groups in the boardroom. Now that might be the chairman and this sort of senior independent director against other directors. It might be the chairman against the CEO. It might be the CEO against the board. It might be executives against non-executives having a different view on it. And it also means that as governance professional, as company secretary, you've got to be the bearer of unwelcome advice, the messenger getting ready to be shot. I always found that one of the most difficult things to do was the bit where you have to tell the CEO, or indeed sometimes the chair, that they don't have the authority to do something that they've probably just said they're going to do, something that they've decided they're going to do, but actually it's a matter for the board, or it's a matter that has to be referred to shareholders, or it's a matter in some private companies that under the sale and purchase agreement has to be referred to an investor director or something like that. Sorry, Chet, you don't have the authority to do that. That's kind of difficult. The other thing that's really difficult and can put you in a slightly awkward position is when your job involves reminding executive colleagues that they have made a commitment to the board that they are going to do a certain thing by the next board meeting. A report that the board has asked for, which that executive colleague in the cold hard light of day may have said during the board meeting they will do, but had actually decided now that they really don't want to provide that piece of information. So gently reminding them, and making sure that sort of thing is carried through. You can also find that the directors, the trustees, the board members will expect the governance professional to know what's going on in every area of the business. So part of what I think the professional needs to do is to ensure they've got their ear to the ground, ensure they've got those reputations, ensure they've got those relationships with their executive colleagues, so that they can pull information together so they know what's going on around the organization. Because sometimes it's that knowing what's going on around the organization when a director gets in touch with you and says, what's going on in so and so? It's actually really useful to have a vague idea of that. And sometimes when you're going out to your executive colleagues, they can regard you as being the enemy. They can regard you as being the corporate snoop or something like that. Actually, you're not. If I always used to say to them, look, I know you've got a problem. I can't help you with that problem, and I can't, I can't help you deal with that problem if I don't know what that problem is. And what I used to find was that people would phone me up and just there would be just a casual, we've got this going on. Oh right, okay, great, that's fine. Thanks for letting me know. And then when you get a query from a director about that, you say, oh yeah, so and so's on top of that. I'll get them to give you an update, something like that. And it meant that it was all a lot smoother. It ran more easily. And again, that's part of what you're doing as the governance professional. Because organizations, when all said and done, are controlled by human beings, and as individuals, we're fallible. As a governance professional, I think what you're doing is creating and supporting the structure underpinning the way in which that organization runs. You're adept at meeting challenges or interpreting sometimes deeply technical regulations. And again, we've just heard there's a white paper promising this. You get more reading matter. It'll almost certainly come out over the summer, just when you want to be on your sunbed with not with a document from DFE. But you are the expert on those regulations, advising discreetly on those important issues, whether that be around the contribution of an individual board member, or whether that be around the strategic direction of the organisation. And the more complex the organisation and the greater the variety in the relationships of its stakeholders, the more there is a requirement for the governance professional to ensure that all those various rights are respected. In the education sector, you've got a variety of stakeholders, many of them, how can I put this, slightly more demanding for good reason than in some other sectors. I mean, parents are deeply, deeply concerned in many cases about the education of their children, and rightly so. And they will have a very close personal interest that is different from perhaps in the corporate sector, where you're very often dealing with a financial, sort of a financial investment that somebody is managing on behalf of somebody else. It's not even their money. But with the education sector, I think it's a lot more personal. So there's that. I think also there's the fact of the role itself. There's the fact of if you go to a dinner party and you say to somebody, I'm a company secretary or I'm a governance professional, what is the reaction that you get? If you were a lawyer going to a dinner party, I don't know if there are any lawyers on the call, and you say you're a lawyer, people will get a picture in their head of what it is that you do. And it will probably be wrong, because the picture will probably involve standing up in court wearing a wig. Somebody who did the conveyancing for your last house purchase probably doesn't do that very often, well, except in fancy dress parties or something like that. If you're an accountant and you are invited to a dinner party, and I'm making a big assumption there, I don't know if there are any accountants on the call, but I'm making a big assumption that an accountant might ever be invited to a dinner party, I don't know. But if you're an accountant and you're invited to a dinner party and you say that's what you do, people will have a picture in their head of the role of an accountant. They kind of don't get that with a company secretary. They kind of don't get that with a governance professional, because the role hasn't got that length of history, I suppose. And so people, whether they be friends at dinner parties, whether they be your colleagues, tend to think of the role as a little bit of backwater. I don't agree with that. And the image that I always use when I'm doing a presentation on the role of the company secretary to people who are absolutely unfamiliar with it, well, let me put it this way, it involves Daniel Craig. It used to involve that picture of him coming out of the sea in his swimming trunks, but I was told that was sexist and I wasn't allowed to do that. So I'm sorry, everybody, I haven't got that slide for you today. But I see our role as not quite James Bond. I don't think we've got a license to kill, not even when the finance team don't produce their papers on time for the umpteenth month running. But I do think we're a sort of corporate troubleshooter. I do see the role of the company secretary as sort of like the senior independent executive. the person who is responsible to the chair and the board from making sure that the organisation runs smoothly. Now it's working with the CEO, that's supporting the CEO, but it's not always working for the CEO. And as I start to wrap up, because I can sense Steve is quietly dozing off in his armchair, even as we do. What I'll just talk about for a couple of minutes is some of the research that we've done on this at the Institute in the last few years. Back in 2013, we asked Andrew Chakrabarty, who's the Professor of Governance and Leadership at Henry Business School, to look at the role. And he did that, and he ran workshops with over 200 company secretaries, chairs, execs, and non-exec directors. And we kicked the tires of that last year to review those findings with another piece of research to see how the role had changed. And some of the things that I just wanted to pull out of that, because what we found is that although the breadth and scope of the role has changed over the last 7 or 8 years, actually fundamentally the basics are broadly similar. So that it's much more than just administrative. There's a lot of company secretaries who would say that they are part of the strategic leadership team of the organisation, a bridge between the executive management and the board, supporting, facilitating the delivery of organisational objectives. It's important that they have direct access to the chair, the CEO, the other directors. Somebody referred in the discussion, and this may be a cultural reference that's a little too old for some of you, but the role reminded them vaguely of Sir Humphrey in Yes Minister. Yeah, the question to the CEO or the chair of, are you sure that's wise, Minister? And just being that support, having that quiet word in the ear. Looking at the role as well, there was quite a bit of feedback that if you have a combined role where you're trying to combine the role of governance professional with some other job in the organisation, that can create difficulties, and you need to think quite carefully about what the responsibilities of that job or those jobs are. So, for example, in the corporate sector, in America, we see very much the combined role of general counsel and company secretary. So that's chief lawyer and company secretary. And in many ways, when you go to a lawyer, and I apologise in advance to the lawyers on call, but when you go to a lawyer, you're very often saying, I want to know how I can do this legally. When you go to the company secretary, the question is more often something along the lines of, should I do this? And there's a difference of approach there. There's also the issue that the company secretary is very often looking at much longer term issues like refreshment of the board in 2 or 3 years' time, whereas the senior lawyer will be looking at this contract that's got to be signed off this week, probably today, probably in the period before 9 AM tomorrow morning, even if that means we're up to 3 AM finishing the thing off. So I don't know about you, but certainly for me, those things that are urgent, I do urgently. Those things that are longer term, I tend to let slide a little bit. As the company secretary, you can't do that, because otherwise everything that you do, you will be letting slide some really, really important things. And when you're looking at the refreshment of the board, when you're looking at boardroom diversity, when you're looking at issues like diversity and inclusion across the business, those are things that you can't suddenly sort out at 6 o'clock on the night before a board meeting. Those are things that need a bit of thinking. They need longer term work. So there's that potential conflict of interest, which I think is important. And there's also the fact that far too many of our directors don't really recognise the breadth of what the company secretary or governance professional can do. And I think that's about us reaching out to them, engaging with them, building a relationship with them, so that we can give best possible support we can do. As I say, just finish off here with some of the bits of feedback we got from members when we kicked the tires of those findings last year. And as I said earlier, a lot of practitioners found that it was easier not to engage in how they define their role. But some of our younger members were coming back having a really different take, highlighting how their contemporaries were astounded by the level of access that they've got to quite senior individuals in the organisations. And sort of the way in which some people in some of those organisations see their role. I mean, sectors differ. In the financial services sector, the role of the governance professional was defined by a number of people as well. It's keeping the chair and the CEO out of jail, and that can be a challenge. And when we asked about what governance achieves, a lot of themes emerged around accountability, keeping order, and ensure that people can constrain the abuses of power. It reassures that public money is being spent appropriately. Provides alignment to purpose. Somebody described it as stopping chaos. And I think most importantly, it supports good decision making within the organisation and across organisations. Possibly the most confident description I saw was something that went along the lines of, I work with boards and business to help advise them on how best to make decisions in accordance with regulation and best practice. I give advice, I listen and help throughout the business. And I think that concept of giving advice and support throughout the business is really important. Some people describe that as a helicopter view, providing holistic solutions which work across departments and silos. And again, I mentioned the referee earlier on. One of the consistent pieces of feedback that we got was that the role of the governance professional is most important in a time of crisis. And like a good referee in a football match, like a good umpire in a cricket match, when things go well, no one really notices them. It's only when there's a problem that they're particularly noticed. And it's that lack of notice that I think is probably also came across as the biggest frustration. And that's because we don't put ourselves out there enough. We don't talk about what we do enough, and we don't necessarily make a song and dance about the crises that we've averted by what we're doing as the governance profession. And I'll just finish off, as I say, with just a summary that somebody put out. It's the best job in the world. It's a mix of specific technical knowledge combined with soft skills, which enable the practitioner to be trusted and persuasive in their role as a discreet advisor. And the thing that struck me most with all of this, that there was a great deal of passion and pride in being a governance professional, whatever the title, whatever the sector. And I think it's probably fair to say that had they been explicitly asked, the majority of the people that we spoke to would probably have expressed some surprise that the relevance of the profession, as I say, there's a number of people who describe the best job in the world, might be questioned.